Okay, and we're off. So I'm very pleased today to welcome Jill Robbins to the podcast, who is the president of Business Fierce. Thank you very much for joining me, Jill. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Johnny.
Excellent stuff. So we've got some interesting topics to discuss today. Take into account your experience and what you do. We're going to be looking at services procurement and looking at how buyers and suppliers can effectively bridge the gap and work together effectively. And also looking at how they can really find the value with a specific emphasis on that keyword there, value. So there's lots of cool stuff for us to get into. Before we do, you've got some very interesting background, and I would love it if you could just talk us through a little bit about how you started off and what your journey's been through the industry.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So I've had we've all, got a story to tell, and been in procurement supply chain for over 20 years now. I started my career in customer service quality assurance, which is nothing to do with supply chain and sourcing. I worked for a small airline. And then after 9/11, I was escorted to my car by armed security. So at 21 years old, was taught some pretty hard knock lessons in life. The job market sucked at that point in time. And then I went to a large hospital network, and I was doing medical information sourcing. So I worked in the IT department, but I was sourcing medical information technology, doing SRM, supplier management, and performance. So that's really where I got the exposure to the external network and the world of procurement as we know it. Our department was then outsourced to Accenture. I did not want to be a consultant at that point in my career, so I went to Ingersoll Rand, and that's really where I fell in love with strategic sourcing. So had a global role, had a great mentor, and had a lot of responsibility. That's back when, we were issuing POs out of Oracle manually. So I would cut POs, I would negotiate contracts, I would, devise category strategies. Really, like, the world was at my fingertips. There was a lot of opportunity. And like I said, that's where I fell in love. I started getting my certifications in purchasing management. That's what it was called 20 years ago. So I have my CPM, I have my CPSM, transformed their indirect team. From there, I went to Eli Lilly and Company, was in a variety of roles, had different responsibilities from research and development to IT. I was in purchase to pay. So I have a strong passion for optimization around, digital procurement, around ensuring the data is right and optimizing processes. So connecting all of those dots. So many people think, well, strategic sourcing's here, purchase to pay is here, but it is all connected and it's all one value chain. I've done, procurement transformation, building teams from the ground up as well. So mostly on the indirect side, I've done new product planning as well. I've got my Lean Six Sigma black belt certification. Also, while in the corporate world, my husband and I have been entrepreneurs. So I've written a children's book. We have run franchise of indoor trampoline parks. We have a warehousing business. So, I see things from a different lens. So having been in the corporate world for a long time, I'm able to see across the value chain, ask some of the tough questions, break down silos. So it's given me a really unique perspective versus just being, a corporate employee for that 20 years. And, what we're going to talk about today, I think I'll be able to share a lot of those insights in my unique perspective based on my experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I like the kind of juxtaposition between the procurement and the sourcing side of things and also the entrepreneurial side of things. Because I think in procurement, sometimes, there's quite multifaceted skills required of that type of role. You need to be good at relationships. You need to be good at negotiation. You need to be strategic. You need to be able to plan and be structured. Do you think the work that you've done within that kind of purchasing and procurement world has been useful in the entrepreneurial stuff that you've also done?
Absolutely. It's a two-way street. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of this circular view, if you will. And, the corporate experience, managing billions of dollars in spend across, 60 to 70 countries around the world definitely has given me a strong perspective around operational excellence, driving that supplier accountability from an entrepreneurial mindset, as well as just managing employees and managing the relationships, and treating them as an equal. I've always been a firm believer, everyone that I've ever managed or has been on my team, I don't view myself as an alpha. I view myself as part of the team. I'm there to support, break down barriers, work through the BS that exists in every corporate environment. And that's what we're there for, is to add value. And there's no better seat in a corporation than sitting in indirect procurement. You see across the entire value chain, across all the categories. You can see the inefficiencies, you can see how the silos exist, and how you can then implement efficiency and source so that you're optimizing that third party spend.
Yeah, it's quite a unique position, isn't it? In the sense that you get a great visibility internally, but you also
Mm-hmm.
get this external view as well, where you're looking out to the suppliers and seeing what's happening in the market, but also you're getting the feedback
Mm-hmm.
from the suppliers and what's going on within your organization. And I think we can come on to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but I think you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly strategic kind of pivot point within an organization.
Yep.
But one thing I was going to ask you, you mentioned about your mentor early on, when you were kind of really falling in love with the procurement world. How important do you think that was? And the reason I asked that is I had a really interesting conversation with the chief procurement officer of Kantar recently, and he was kind of saying it's a shame that for some people, a lot of people tend to sort of fall into procurement,
Yes.
whereas actually, and to a certain extent, sometimes the value of procurement hasn't been maybe as recognized as it should be within organizations. I think possibly COVID has changed that, because procurement have had to absolutely come to the fore. But how important for you was that, having a strong mentor to make you kind of grow into it and appreciate this sector?
Yeah. So, having a strong mentor is critical. And, a lot of companies have it very structured. I think, keeping it informal, keeping it fluid, and keeping it safe is critical. We are human. You are going to make mistakes. You cannot be hung out to dry. If you're trying, something new within a category, if you're looking to the marketplace for innovative solutions or advanced technologies, you've got to have some freedom and some wiggle room to try new things. And, there was one contract that I was negotiating at the time. I was at Ingersoll Rand, and we were looking to bring in a new technology. I was in the security and safety division, so it was a kind of a keyed lock system that was proprietary in New Zealand. We ended up acquiring the company. It was a smaller company, but at the time we were just negotiating with them, and I was able to bring the cost down by 50%. Just by having a conversation. So, one of my taglines for Business Fierce is, you don't get what you don't ask for. That applies in business, that applies in life. You may get no, but you'll get a lot better yes than you ever thought possible. So just having that support system, and, knowing that, your career is fluid. And you're able to make mistakes, you're able to try new things, and you're not going to be crucified by doing so. So it's really that, culture of, those relationships, that support system, and knowing that it's a safe environment. And I think, like you said, COVID has highlighted the importance of procurement and supply chain. But having that access to real-time data, to real-time analytics has been a struggle, right? That's why we've seen supply chain disruptions, because procurement has been reactive for many, many decades. And it's time for us to be proactive, and to start asking the tough questions. Our counterparts in sales, they would never tolerate the crappy data that we have to deal with day in and day out, the lack of visibility. They have, CRM data that is readily available, and it's of course what you put into it. But procurement is an engine that is critical to a successful organization. So it can't just be about top line growth. And procurement can definitely contribute to that top line growth. You can have creative terms and conditions in services contracts, shared accountability, shared risk models, whether it's with an agency, whether it's with a consulting supplier. But having that accountability and that two-way street, don't just sign up for a fee for service, because your suppliers should be an extension of your company. And if they don't have skin in the game and they just want to meet their quarterly numbers, I've got that deal signed, and then poof, they just disappear. That should be pretty telling to you about that company and that salesperson.
Yeah, I mean, it never ceases to amaze me, the lack of information, particularly within services procurement that teams have. I mean, in the area of goods and materials, where it's a lot of catalog buying, okay, it's complex supply chains, but generally people will have the information. And traditional kind of top level procurement systems are much more geared towards handling that kind of more binary type of transaction. With services, it's just so complex and nuanced, but there's so much potential value there. And I think when you look at the influence of procurement within the C-suite, for example, as we talked about earlier, procurement sit at this kind of junction of where there's a lot of data going both ways. But if that's not captured, and if procurement people are just transacting rather than engaging in strategic activities, then that really does limit that exposure and the value going through to the C-suite. And interestingly, I don't know if you saw the Deloitte CPO survey recently. Some really interesting stuff in that. One of the things that I found quite surprising that someone else was talking about recently was just that I think the percentage was around 70% of CPO, around 70% of the time of most CPOs is actually spent on transactional activity rather than strategic. And the people that were really leading the field were still spending 60% of the time on transactional activity.
Yes.
And that's where I think the kind of digital transformation, use of best of breed technology can really change that. But yeah, just moving from that transacting to a strategic point of view, and being able to identify the best suppliers. So in terms of like value and driving the top line or driving the bottom line, if procurement have that visibility, then they can see whether services suppliers are providing an effective service, but they can also see where they're delivering additional value. And this is where it comes into that kind of cost versus value conversation, in the sense of, yeah, you could cut costs, but if you're cutting costs, you might be cutting out suppliers that are actually driving growth and giving you significant returns. But with the COVID situation, how do you think, if you look at the US in particular, people just had to get stuff done. How do you think that's changed the relationship of procurement with their organizations and the view of procurement in general?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question, but just to back up to a comment that you had made, around the transactional, I see that tactical and that transactional information to be pivotal to driving that strategic value. So if you don't get that right, then you are potentially setting up, your category managers, your strategic sourcing professionals to fail. So you've got to get that right. And it's an engine, and it's, that value chain connectivity. So I really think that, the struggle with CPOs is they're not investing in, they're like, oh, well, that'll just get taken care of by P2P or by the operational team. And it's like, no, there is so much value there, and it's garbage in, garbage out. So you have to have that diligence, that data governance, and capturing all of the right metadata from those contracts, the KPIs, if there's, a supplier management plan. So really having that discipline up front to do the right thing, so that you're not putting band-aids and you're not chasing things downstream, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. It makes total sense. I mean, they've got to automate.
Yes.
And I think if you look at services, unless you can capture it on a granular level, not just up to the point of contract, but post contract, what's actually being delivered, what was actually agreed. Typically most organizations find that very difficult in the kind of top level P2P S2P systems.
Yep.
And as you say, if they're spending all of their time doing transactional and tactical stuff, clearly a lot of that is going through manual processes. If they can automate that, they can automate the bits that need automating, then they can take that data and translate that into the strategic value.
Yep. And just don't discount. So automate and validate and inspect so that then that becomes a catapult and a launching pad so that you're able to deliver that strategic value. So to answer the COVID question, a lot was highlighted after and during and early on in COVID, right? I can remember, at Elanco Animal Health, our CEO, our CFO, they wanted to know every supplier that had payment terms less than X, pull every contract. That was a huge manual effort because we were in the process of separating from a previous parent. Contracts were all over the place. The metadata was not captured. So it physically took attorneys. It took sourcing professionals manually going through those contracts, putting it in an Excel file, and then reporting it up. That's ridiculous, right? In this day and age, you've got to automate and you have to have that information readily available. There are systems out there that can do it. There's artificial intelligence, there's machine learning, there's RPA, leverage all of those technologies. But what indemnification clauses, what termination for convenience do we have? What are alternative sources of supply? How are we, mapping that supply chain and all of the subcontractors? So what COVID has highlighted is you have got to be proactive and you have to use those advanced technologies so that you have those reports at your fingertips. You can say, oh, well, this supplier is performing optimally here, and having that 360-degree feedback. Here are the alternative sources of supply. And here are all of the terms that we have in that contract. The other thing, Johnny, is when you're working in a global organization, you have sourcing professionals or operational professionals or legal professionals around the world that may be negotiating a contract with that same supplier that you already have a contract with. So you could have 5, 10 different contracts with an IBM or with a PwC. And it's shame on the company, right? You should know your suppliers better than they know you. And that's not always the case. And COVID has highlighted that, you can be taken advantage of unbeknownst to you. So getting that data and getting your house in order is hypercritical so that you're optimizing your OpEx and you're maximizing your top line growth.
Yeah, and it kind of just keys into that overall accountability, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
On both sides, procurement's accountability to have control of the data, and just the overall C-suite responsibility and accountability to give procurement the scope to have that control and have that data. And I think COVID has just really proved how important that is. And I think it's also done some really good things for procurement as well in showing how well procurement teams have adapted and just had to, as I say, just get things done almost in like an emergency footing. Suddenly all the things that might normally get in the way of procurement doing their job were to a certain extent removed. But as you say, the lack of automated infrastructure and data capture around what they're doing generally was highlighted as a real problem. So just on the point of that accountability, so there's the accountability within the organization. What about the accountability on the supply side? Just in terms of that value proposition, delivery to the customer, and then what the customer does with it.
Yep. Yeah. So, for me, selling a solution, selling a good, selling a service, or a software solution, great. You've done your job. You've sold the value. You've got the contract signed. But for me, that relationship starts once that contract is signed. So how are you seeing through and committing to everything you promised? So how did the implementation go? Are you validating? Do you have the right KPIs in place? I'm a big fan of that shared accountability. It's a two-way street, right? You don't want finger pointing, you want collaboration. So ensure that you've got the right metrics and the accountability in place so that both the customer and the supplier are successful. And you have to have regular check-ins. It can't be these quarterly business reviews that then become a dog and pony show and you're just trying to upsell. Tell me, how are things going? And then you can have real dialogue, and then you can talk about, oh, well, we need to optimize here, we need to tweak here. So it should be just like any relationship. It can't happen on a one-off basis, and you have to have, like you said, that circular view, in those check-ins and agreed upon metrics so that both parties have skin in the game.
Yeah, and it's I think it's interesting when you look at different supplier business models and commercial models in terms of how much they're kind of like one and done, and the suppliers got what they want, and they're not super motivated through their commercial model to continue to support it perhaps as well as they could do, versus either the slightly different models or situations where procurement position it very effectively so that the supplier is invested in the long-term success of whatever it is they're delivering. I mean, that certainly for our business model, managing services spend with technology, it's absolutely tied into the successful management of the, you know, as much addressable spend as possible. So it motivates us towards that long-term goal. You know, as an organization, that's the way we think anyway. But for some suppliers, I think it must be quite, or it can be quite tricky, because their commercial model is almost like training them to kind of just do the deal and then leave it. And I think there's a responsibility with procurement teams to make sure that doesn't happen as well.
Correct. And, you know, I would coach, you know, these organizations and their sales teams, because, you know, procurement, they build a relationship with that account rep, with that sales rep. And if they then hand it off to a customer success team and then they poof disappear and they're on to the next account and they're on to the next commission check, shame on them, because they should still have a pulse on what is going on. And, you know, they're accountable. They signed that deal. They got that deal. They understand all the nuances within that customer. And then if you just hand it off to somebody else, there is no way that they understand everything it took 6 months prior, 8 months prior. Some deals at these large enterprises take up to a year or more. So having that person needs to be involved during that implementation, and they should have skin in the game. They shouldn't get their full commission if the implementation fails, right? I mean, I think some of these incentive models and the sales compensation models are flawed in that respect. And they should be spread out across, hey, that implementation, is the customer happy? Are we delivering on what we promised? So, you know, that's a challenge, I think, on both sides. And those conversations need to be happening. And sometimes it's a tough conversation, because that's not how, you know, whether it's a tech company, whether it's a consulting company, you know, that's not how it's measured. You know, once a deal's signed, it's like, oh, you know, now we'll issue, you know, all of the reward and recognition.
And so at that kind of post-contract signature point, what do you see as the key ongoing role of procurement on that side? Because again, depending on how systems and processes are set up, I mean, in a lot of organizations with services, we see, you know, a contract will get signed, it will get put in a shared file, and it's never looked at again. And that's not procurement's fault, because if procurement want to find any information, as you said, with the kind of COVID stuff, you've got to go and manually read through it. Are there any milestones? Have they changed since? Has anyone even measured them? So what do you see as the key role of procurement at that post-contract signature point?
In a perfect world, I would say that, you know, there should be checkpoints, you know, whether it's on a monthly basis, on a bi-monthly basis, and, you know, there should be KPIs defined, and shared metrics. So how are we performing? How is our team performing? Whether it's in marketing, whether it's in, IT, whether it's in, research and development, wherever, it falls within the business, there should be that two-way dialogue, and it shouldn't just sit in a shared file in a black hole and then get pulled out, on a quarterly basis. And then it's like, okay, oh shit, we've got to, validate all of these metrics. It really should be a fluid two-way conversation and accountability. And I view it, as, sports, every point of the game, whether, it's basketball, whether it's golf, whether it's baseball, you don't just check in at the end of the game and see how everyone performed on the team. You're doing check-ins. The coach, hey, you need to tweak this. Hey, you're sitting out because you screwed this up. So it should be the same mentality. And, it can't just be a one and done. So taking that big picture view, and then having all of those checkpoints, and like I said, I'm a broken record, but getting the right KPIs in place, and then showing your cards, say, hey, we did not perform up to snuff here. This is what we're going to do about it. And this is what we're going to tweak. And then sharing with the customer, hey, this person didn't show up to this meeting. This person, didn't follow through and deliver on these 3, milestones. So it set us back. So, you have to have that trust and that open dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important point you make there around this whole concept of this two-way street, because just the concept of procurement, looking at it and looking at their organization and saying, how are we performing in trying to get towards this objective? I think that's crucial, because how often do suppliers end up in a situation where they're trying to do their job and they're getting held up by delays that are completely outside of their control? Yeah. And often they can end up getting, blamed for that, where it's not necessarily their fault. So I think that's a critical thing to kind of identify and understand. But it's quite a hard thing to measure unless you're actively tracking the project as it goes. And one of the things that we look at is in terms of measuring supplier performance, we'll look at quantitative metrics around, for every project that's delivered at a milestone level, is it on time? Is it to budget? Was there any scope creep? And other kind of metrics. But the qualitative side of it is incredibly important, just in terms of, overall, did the supplier do a good job? Might be measuring them on things like innovation or diversity or communication. But if these things are being, both the qualitative and quantitative things are being looked at, it gives you that accurate overall picture, because an organization, a supplier might go over budget and it might take longer. They might have nailed it first time and they might have done a great job. Unless you're combining those areas of feedback and actually capturing it, that could look very different for a CFO looking at budget versus spend, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why you have to track, and you have to be very transparent, because if the business has said, hey, we need to add here, we need to take away here, and you're not looking at the qualitative and the quantitative together, and they'll just say, well, there was scope creep, or there was, a change order here. It's like, well, what was the context? What were the underlying circumstances? And oftentimes they have to look themselves in the mirror and say, hey, we caused that, right? So, our supplier was working with us alongside and delivering, and they made the proper modifications. So I'm a big fan of, the more you are able to track, and not to be, arduous about it, right? You need to make it as simplistic as possible so that, both parties are playing nicely. But then, the data can be used to both parties' advantage.
Yeah, and some of that works up front, isn't it? Defining the requirement effectively, defining the KPIs, defining the deliverables, capturing that, not just sitting in a PDF, but actually capturing that in a system, then actually measuring against what's been agreed isn't that arduous.
Yes.
But just touching on one other point, just regards to the kind of two-way street of that relationship and who's performing in trying to meet that objective. I sometimes hear stories of consultancies having maybe being left with a slightly bad taste in their mouth, or slightly disappointed in terms of being brought in to deliver advice and proposals that don't get actioned. You know, that classic thing of coming in and doing a piece of work and putting it all in place and then being seen as having possibly not done a very good job because the client didn't implement it, but they weren't necessarily asking the consultancy to then help them implement it.
Yeah.
What's your, is that the sort of thing you see? And do you hear that sort of frustration within suppliers?
I do. And I have strong opinions on this. And, you know, not all consultancy firms are created equal. And so I'll just put the moose on the table. So many of these marquee firms breed, you know, lifetime advisors or consultants, and they've never worked in a business. Right. And I have a hard time taking advice and paying tens of millions of dollars for an opinion or a recommendation when they have never done it in the business world or within that industry or within that function. So the onus is on procurement and on the business, and procurement has a very unique seat, and they are an objective third party. They can ask the tough questions. Don't be afraid to piss somebody off. Do it in a polite and respectful way, but ask some of those tough questions, because their resume may look great, but if they've worked at 5 different, you know, Accenture, at, you know, PwC, at KPMG, at McKinsey, at BCG, okay, great. But did you actually own what you recommended? Did you actually see it through? Do you understand all the inner workings of the business? Because when you work in a business, there are a lot of moving pieces, and it's easy to just fly in and call out 20 things that are being done wrong and then say, fix all of these things and your ROI will go up this much, your margin will go up this much, you know, and you'll improve your OPEX by 20%. Bullshit. You know, that's, you know, you really have to understand. So I am a big fan of people who have actually worked in businesses, whether that be private equity, whether that be, you know, in, you know, any type of industry business. But you need hands-on experience. And I'm speaking because I've worked in a business and I've been an entrepreneur. So I bring a unique set of experiences and lens to this. Not to say, you know, all recommendations are bad, but what I have seen is they fly in, they interview, you know, 50 people, and then they regurgitate what has, you know, they heard within those interviews. And it's like, take a step back. If you would just listen to your people, you would probably, you know, be more profitable and more efficient, because they're just regurgitating and getting paid tens of millions of dollars. So that's been some of my experiences. I am a fan of, you know, the niche consultancy firms that have deep expertise in their domain, you know, whether that's procurement, whether that's supply chain, whether that's marketing, you know, whether that's, you know, M&A, but defaulting to, and executives are guilty of this across every industry, across all over the world. They get sold by a lot of these big firms that promise the world, and then they have to end up hiring someone else or cleaning it up, or like you say, that, you know, they don't follow through. So it's a tough balance. And I think when you have a practitioner that has seen, hey, this is what it's actually going to take, and here is a team that can execute on that. So I can do an assessment, I can make all of these recommendations, and then, you know, you can follow through with a very action-oriented, accountable team. So that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully made some sense.
No, it's super interesting to hear your opinions on that and feedback from real stuff you've actually seen, because I totally agree with you. You know, I'm of an entrepreneurial mindset myself as well, and it's never as simple as just running a formula. You know, stuff happens. It's real life. It's real people. a business to a certain extent always has an organic element to it. It's not just metric driven. So yeah, I totally agree. And I think when you look at the relationships that exist with some of these big strategic consultancies, they don't even go anywhere near procurement a lot of the time. But I think that's changing, where procurement are being brought in more to get involved. And things like COVID have helped because let's face it, procurement teams and services procurement are pretty good at working to budget. But the tricky thing is, if the right technology isn't in place, if they haven't got the data, they can't really work to value. So hitting budget is one thing, but actually knowing what you're getting from it is another. And when you go through something like COVID, just working to budget isn't good enough anymore. When companies are spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year. So I think the supplier visibility side of things is also really important, because when you've got these big suppliers, they tend to have blanket coverage. And it's the whole thing of, you never get fired for bringing in X big name, whoever you think. And having visibility of the performance in your supply chain, particularly, one of the things that we like to do with clients is break it down by category. So for example, they might have one of the big financial consultancies doing a great job in finance and accounting, but they're spending tens of millions with them a year in, marketing services or something like that, where they've got some really specific suppliers. They're actually doing a much better job, but it's just getting kind of washed through. And I think also that's where organizations can miss a trick on things like innovation and supplier diversity, where within their supply chain, they might have these fantastic suppliers, but if they're not identifying them, these smaller ones just kind of blend into the background a little bit.
Yep.
And it's missed opportunity.
Absolutely. Yep. And, that's why having that, full balanced scorecard is hypercritical. And, having that objective, data and those metrics is powerful. Data tells a story, and then you can make informed decisions based on that. But it takes everyone playing nicely together, because if you have holes and, either the supplier's not responding or the client's not responding, then it becomes difficult. So, making that an easy effort to get that accountability, to get that supplier performance and everything in one place, visualize it, tie it to, how the category is performing overall, what's the spend on contract, what's the percent of spend with approved suppliers, with diverse suppliers, what innovation are they bringing to the table, what's the impact on the top line and bottom line. So, tying all of that together is a very, very powerful tool.
Yeah, and when you think about it, bearing in mind the size of the spend on services of all types, I've seen estimates somewhere between $1 trillion and 20 trillion annual. It's incredible that this problem hasn't been solved before, but it's a very complex one. But just to go back to a point you made there of talking about the kind of the feedback side of things. So that you mentioned the supplier scorecarding, but 360-degree feedback is another area I thought would be interesting to touch on, in the sense that that is something that's probably a lot of organizations find quite difficult to do, and a lot of suppliers find it quite difficult to get their point across. Do you think that the bit that's mainly missing in that 360-degree feedback is actually the clients themselves taking that feedback back in, or do you think it's just a process that's not done very well in general?
Probably all of the above, Johnny.
Right.
I think, traditionally procurement is always understaffed. It doesn't matter the size of the company. There is always a fire drill, whether you are the most strategic professional managing, a category, you get pulled in to all kinds of tactical stuff, whether it's with your stakeholders, whether it's with, the P2P organization, whether it's with your boss or, someone asking, to run a report. And that's what I talked about early on is we've got to become more proactive so that we can work collaboratively and we can get all of that feedback. So, it's making it easy to do the right thing. And that's something that has to happen and using advanced technologies to do so.
Yeah, like we said before, it's automating the things that need automating.
Yeah.
And, procurement people have all these fantastic skills, a broad range of skills that can come together to form a strategic opinion based on data. But if they're spending all of their time running around dealing with manual processes and totally inefficient stuff, which is why there's a lot of investment at the moment in procurement technology, because it's an area that maybe has been underserved, but particularly in very specific areas. So like we were talking about kind of specific verticals, where there are differences. And I think the market's definitely starting to recognize that now. But just going back to a kind of probably one of the key points that that we were going to discuss today is around value. So obviously there's feedback going both ways. If there's more visibility, if you look at the sales side of it from a supplier point of view, I know you've got some interesting opinions around the kind of value-driven approach versus just quotas.
Yes. Yeah. Anytime you're selling, you really need to do your homework on the target, on the customer. Slow down. And, just like you hear from recruiting coaches, don't send the same resume to every company because, so the same applies to selling. It can't be the same sales message to every company that you're selling to. Get to know them on a personal level. If they are publicly traded, listen to their earnings calls. Don't just read the transcript. Listen to the inflection, in the voices. Listen to the analysts' questions because they will ask some real zingers and they will put these executives on the spot and you will hear them, tumble. I mean, they will not answer every question the way that they probably wish they would have. So use that and you'll understand what challenges they're facing, what opportunities are on the table, and tie your solution into what's their, strategic growth trajectory. What are their priorities, near term, longer term? And that will then give you a leg up. And then you can start talking about what the value is. So something that I like to use with my clients is from BCG, and it breaks down the different value levers. So there's 7 procurement value levers. So there's commercial levers. So around supplier management, around bundling, location optimization. So basic things we've all heard of, but speak procurement's language. When you are selling to procurement, you want to make them the hero. Then there's process levers. What can you do from a demand management perspective? And you may not be able to hit every single one of these 7, but where your solution, where your good, where your service comes in, tie those and play that up. And then you're able to articulate, what is that ROI? What is that total cost optimization? I'm not a big fan of total cost of ownership because it can be very arbitrary. But when you talk about total cost optimization, that's where you can, their ears will open up and do more listening than talking. So before you get to this point, you've done your homework, ask the open-ended questions with procurement. And then you can talk about, the process optimization, the demand management. Hey, what are your near-term priorities here? What are the longer-term priorities? And then the technical levers are around that standardization and that redesign, make versus buy. This is a big one in procurement. Historically, procurement thought they could do everything in-house. And as you've talked about, there are all of these solutions in procurement and supply chain that are coming to market. There is more venture capital money being invested in procurement technologies, supply chain technologies than any other, technical information technology space out there. I mean, it is unbelievable just how many solutions are popping up because there's a real need around sustainability, around, supplier visibility, you name it. What we just talked about, supplier performance management, supplier identification. So, that's what I would say, Johnny, is going to set, sellers apart is, listening more than talking, doing your homework. Don't just pitch, truly understand, so you can then become that trusted advisor. And if your solution is not best for a particular client, say so. Say, hey, there's someone I'd like to introduce you to that I think would be better suited. And they will remember that and they will come back to you and you may have an opportunity, 6 months, 12 months down the road, and they will remember, hey, they didn't just try to sell me their solution. They knew it wasn't the best time. It wasn't the best fit. So don't be afraid to do that.
Yeah, and they'll recommend you.
Yes.
And ultimately it comes down to genuinely trying to solve a problem rather than just trying to sell something. But I love the point you made about listening. What was I heard the other day? There are 4 skills to communication: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And listening is the only one you don't get taught in school. It's kind of like you don't really learn, and it's the one you do the most of. So yeah, it's a very, very valid point. But listen, that's been really super interesting. Some great points we could cover there. I think we could. There's a lot more we could discuss. Maybe we'll have to do a round 2 at some point. But
sure.
Just before we wrap up, I'd be really interested to understand. So, in terms of the challenges that you're looking at with your customers at the moment, do you see over the next, say, 12 months? Obviously, it's been a crazy time. There's all sorts of big things globally going on. What do you see as the kind of key challenges that you expect to be helping your customers with, specifically over the next 12 months?
It's really around getting inside procurement's head, and making my clients procurement insiders. There are so many people, and you've experienced it, being in this space for 20 years, very, very intelligent business people. What is procurement? Never heard of procurement. And there are sales folks that have sold, to organizations, avoided procurement intentionally because their CRO has told them to do so, because procurement slows things down. You're going to give away value. I teach my clients the opposite. If procurement is not brought in early, ask for procurement to be brought in, because they are a wealth of information. So, don't make procurement the enemy. They really can be your biggest ally. Like I said, doing your homework is hypercritical. Then you build credibility. Once you do have that conversation, whether it's with a business stakeholder, whether it's with procurement, they'll say, hey, they really do understand our business. And asking those open-ended questions, listening, and using storytelling. Talk about the value that you've delivered at like-sized companies within the same industry. That really goes a long way. Procurement looks for those case studies, for those white papers. So build those. Don't be verbose about it. They don't need to be 20 pages long, but really get to the point. And that will go a long way as well. And be flexible and adaptable. Procurement professionals are smart. They can see the big picture. They see across the value chain. They are fierce negotiators. It's something that they are trained to do. They are not afraid of conflict, but they do want to be collaborative. So, work with them so that they're not on the defensive and they are on your side, and you can play offense with procurement and supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And, ultimately it comes down to, if you make procurement's life easy, it'll make your life easy. And, if you give them what they need to, if you genuinely got a useful service or product for the business, if they can buy it in the right way and it can deliver the value and they're confident that you're going to do a good job, they're happy because they're doing their job.
And it's a very, as you know, it's a very small community. There are a lot of us around the world, but we are very well networked. There are collaborative workspaces, and, procurement folks are not afraid to share, pricing information, performance information, what, someone else has done, how they're performing. So keep that in mind. Outperform your peers so that you have a leg up when, a topic of conversation comes up, and you can save money on marketing because word of mouth is so much more powerful and it's free.
Exactly. And any kind of bad feedback, people remember it.
Yes, they do. And they're not afraid to share it either.
Excellent stuff. Well, listen, thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate your time. I've really enjoyed that conversation. It's definitely triggered off a few thought processes in it for me as well with some of your feedback, and I'm sure people will find that very useful. But yeah, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me. And morning, I'm assuming, in Indianapolis, whereas it's afternoon in the UK. So I hope you have a really good rest of the day.
Yes, thank you. You as well. Take care of
Excellent.
all those animals.
Yeah, will do. Take care of yourself. I'll catch up with you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers, Jill. Bye.